From advertising to software as a service to data.
Across all of our programs and clients, we've seen a 55 to 65% open rate.
Getting brands authentically integrated into content performs better than TV advertising.
Typical lifespan of an article is about 24 to 36 hours.
If we're reaching out to the right person with the right message and a clear call to action, then it's just a matter of timing.
Welcome to the Martech Podcast, a Ben J. Schaap LLC production. In this podcast, you'll hear the stories of world-class marketers that use technology to drive business results and achieve career success. We'll unearth the real-world experiences of some of the brightest minds in the marketing and technology space so you can learn the tools, tips, and tricks they've learned along the way. Now here's the host of the Martech Podcast, Benjamin Shapiro.
Welcome back to the Martech Podcast. It's just you and me today, marketers. And for those of you who are new to the Martech Podcast community, in this episode, like we do at the end of every month, I'm going to tell you how we practice what we preach in the marketing of this show. Well, so far we've hit the ground running in 2019, and now that we're in the swing of things, we've got some big goals ahead of us. In my last monthly update, I described my process for setting annual goals, so I wanted to start off this podcast by restating some of the things that we're trying to accomplish. In terms of our non-quantifiable goals, some of my focuses and the team's focuses are about understanding who our listeners are. We want to mitigate some of the risk in terms of growing our podcast by cultivating new channels. We're trying to add utility and value in multiple formats of content. And we're going to evaluate opportunities to build a podcast network, expanding beyond just the Martech Podcast into producing a couple other shows. In terms of some of the goals that are quantifiable and how we track to make sure that we achieve everything we want, we're trying to reach 100,000 downloads a month for the Martech Podcast this year, and we're hoping that we can turn that into $100,000 of sponsorship revenues. As part of that, we want to reach 100 different guests, 100 different new networking conversations. And outside of the Martech Podcast, we're going to try to scale one new podcast and revive one of the older podcast projects that I've been working on. Thinking back on the Martech Podcast performance from last year and reflecting on that as we look at our goals, I invested around $10,000 in marketing and reached a peak of 13,000 downloads per month last year, which works out a cost of roughly 77 cents per download. And since 90% of our listeners are subscribers, I'm estimating our cost to be about 85 cents a subscriber. So as I think about our goals for this year, if we want to reach 100,000 downloads per month at the current cost per download, we're going to need to invest about $77,000 out of the $100,000 that we're hoping to make on marketing. So the vast majority of the money that we're going to be taking in from sponsors should be heading back into our marketing efforts. So that works out to about $6,500 a month in marketing, which feels like a lot. So hopefully there's some economies of scale as we invest in other channels and as we mature our sophistication of marketing, our cost per download will decrease. But for right now, we're looking at about a $6,500 budget, which feels like a lot since we spent only $10,000 last year. That said, let's talk about what we've done this month and how it's performed. First off, in terms of content production, we published a lot of content. We've actually published content on 21 of the 24 business days this week, which is a new record for the show. So we're moving more towards a daily format. Maybe more importantly, specifically thinking about CMO Week, which we launched last week, where I interviewed 5 CMOs from publicly traded companies. We've raised the bar in terms of the profile of some of the guests. So I'm really proud of the content that we've published this month, and I hope that you've enjoyed the mix of subjects, formats, and the types of guests that we're interviewing. We're working more on trying to reach influencers and people that have had notable careers in marketing. And not to say that our previous guests haven't been wonderful marketers, but we're hoping to parlay some of the guests that we've talked to early on this year to be able to get access to a different type of marketer that we didn't have access to last year, that basically are outside of my personal network. That said, outside of trying to consistently produce great content, I invested about $4,500 into 2 marketing channels this month. The first being an App Store optimization service that I paid $3,000 to ensure that our show is going to rank in the top 75 for business podcasts in the Apple iTunes Store. And this is really partially about growth, but it's also about building credibility and showing that our potential sponsors should have trust in us because we're constantly being rated as a top show. The second channel is our tried and true podcast advertising, which we run through the Knit Dynamic Insertion platform. We spent about $1,500 this month. Actually, we spent exactly $1,500 this month on podcast ads, and we did it over a 2-week period in the middle of the month. We saw a really nice spike in terms of daily downloads during the weeks when we were doing our advertising. So to me, there's definitely still meat on the bone in terms of that channel, but we're trying to test some other channels to figure out how we can rely on multiple channels. So if something happens to our ability to scale the Knit platform, we have other options. So in terms of performance, at the time of this recording, when there's still 2 full days and 2 full episodes left to publish, we've seen a little over 16,000 downloads this month, which means that we should land close to 17,500 downloads for the month, which, hey, that's really exciting. It's a new record for the show, and so I'm really excited about the progress we've made at the beginning of the year. So let's talk about what that means in terms of our goals. First off, the show grew by 5,000 to 6,000 downloads this month, which feels really awesome, but we upped our marketing spend by roughly 5x of what we were doing last year. So our average cost per download was 25 cents, which is significantly lower than it was in 2018, but we're also working with a much larger installed base. So I don't know if you could necessarily compare the average cost per download from this month to what we were doing last year. I think the key metric to look at is our cost per new download. Since we added about 6,000 downloads for $4,500, that works out to 75 cents per new download. And I think that number is a little misleading because we took a week off of publishing in December. So if we calculate the difference between our previous best month in terms of downloads, which was November when we had 13,500 downloads, there was really only a 4,000 download difference between our peak month when we were publishing a full month of content and this month. So I think that means our cost per download was probably closer to $1.13. So moral of the story is we invested more than ever in marketing this month, and our cost per download was somewhere in the range of the spend efficiency that we had throughout last year, whether it's 75 cents per new download or $1.13 per new download. That's pretty much in the range of what it cost to acquire a new download last year. So far this month, I'd have to say we've hit a tipping point. We're now firmly into the scale portion of running the Martech podcast as a business. We are very excited. We have sponsorship revenue coming in. I think that we have done a nice job building our sponsors into the content of our show and finding sponsors that are going to make interesting content. So you, our listeners, are going to not think that we're just constantly beating you over the head with advertising, but also really interested in what our sponsors have to say. And we're taking the revenue from those sponsorship relationships and we're trying to grow our community of Martech podcast listeners. So as I look back on this month, I'm really excited about the trajectory that we're on. I think that we've invested a lot more into marketing. We're seeing good returns. So the show is growing at a healthy clip. I think we're going to keep an eye on what our spend efficiency is and test some new channels to see if we can acquire new downloads at a less expensive pace. But I think that we're on a trajectory where we're targeting reaching our goal of 100,000 downloads per month. So I'm really excited about the direction we're heading. Most importantly, I think that we're launching some great content. I learned a ton this month. CMO Week was amazing. Lots of other great guests. And so I'm excited to bring you that content. And we've got a lot of other great shows lined up. So thank you for dedicating the time to listening to this podcast and for making it so rewarding to produce. We're looking forward to bringing you more content next month. Okay, that's it for this month, but until next time, my advice is to just focus on keeping your customers happy.